Just real quick, I'm Raymond Camden. I am a dev advocate for IBM and mainly focused on Node and APIs and stuff. I've been doing a lot of serverless as well. And what I'm really hoping is that people will endorse me on LinkedIn for enterprise cat code because I want to see the recruiter spam I get for that. If you want to follow me on my blog, it's raymondcamden.com, and I tweet at Raymond Camden, and it's all serious enterprise IBM stuff. So you should definitely follow me there. It's never anything like comic books or Star Wars, I promise. So just real quick, why Loopback? Number one reason, it's built on Node, which I'm assuming in this crowd is an okay thing to say. I spent a long time doing Cold Fusion, and excuse me, when I left Cold Fusion, I went to Node, and I was really happy with Node. So I tend to do everything on the server now in that technology. So that's the number one reason. Second thing is that it's really easy to use, and I hope that y'all see that tonight in what I do. I've been doing Node for a couple of years now, which means I'm really bad at it currently. I'm really great at building bad things in Node. In 10 years, I think I'll be good at it. I love using it, don't get me wrong, but I definitely have a lot to learn. What I like about Loopback is that you definitely do not have to be an expert at all. I get by with my bad knowledge and I build great things with Loopback, and it helps me be successful. It's open source. IBM is definitely one of the main organizations working on it, but other people contribute as well. Very much focused on API creation. That's pretty much all it does. So that's the purpose for it. So no big surprise there. But it supports everything else too, and I'll talk about the non-API aspects working with Loopback. So why build APIs? And again, this is maybe the wrong crowd to mention this because probably everyone already knows this, but I like to kind of think of this as well when I'm building a new project. I tend to think of two main reasons. The first one being that you want to share your data. So you have this cat data that's really important. And you know that if you share this data, people can do great things with it. And that may lead to more business, or it may be a humanitarian type thing as well. Sharing your data allows people to do new and cool things. You also may just be building APIs for your own stuff. So you have a client-side application built in Vue.js, or you have a Apache Cordova hybrid mobile app, or you've built a Alexa thing and you need APIs for that. And then of course you actually could be doing both of that. So you can have APIs that are meant to be used externally and APIs that you are also using for your own applications. So let's talk about Loopback and why you would use that to build APIs. So it is an open source framework. I already said it was open source, but I'll say it again. Again, focused on building APIs and really kind of focused on the rapid creation of APIs. And I'll talk a bit more about models and what that means. Loopback makes a lot of assumptions for APIs, and in my experience, it's right 90% of the time. And what you will see is that it's also very easy to customize it to match that other 10%. It also has a really kind of simple ORM system. This is definitely not a Hibernate type solution, but if you don't enjoy writing SQL queries, or if you don't enjoy writing Mongo Git commands, Loopback will actually handle all of that for you. And what's kind of nice about this is because you have this little ORM system, you can do non-API stuff as well. Part of that is working with Express. So Express was kind of my gateway drug to really liking Node. I don't know about y'all in the audience, but I can remember 5 or so years ago, I was still doing Cold Fusion. I'd obviously heard of Node. I was interested in it. I would go to a Node presentation, intro to Node, and it was the same thing every time. Let's build a web server. And I had no interest in building a web server. Why? And when I first saw Express, it kind of finally clicked in me, like this is what it would mean to build a web application. So I love that Loopback has that baked in. I can do the API stuff, and if I have non-API kind of boring, let's say admin views, I have Express in there to make that easy to use. It has really detailed security policies. I'm only going to talk about that at a high level, but I like to remind people that, out of the box, Loopback is kind of open-ended, just, do whatever you want. But before you go into production, you could definitely lock everything down. Main website is loopback.io, so all your docs, there's a great blog there as well, and essentially that is where you would want to start. So speaking of getting started, installation requires NPM and Node, and again, I'm assuming in this crowd that y'all already have that installed. When you do, you will install a CLI. It's npm install-g loopback-CLI. And when you have that, you have a command line program called LB. I really wish that every NPM package that installs a CLI, I wish that the last thing it would do is tell you the CLI, because it's so confusing when you install like X, like loopback-CLI, and you get something completely different. So I always share this when I talk about Loopback, because you may not recognize what the actual command is that you get when you're done. So once you have that, you can go to your shell, you could do lb-h and get started. I am going to be using the Windows subsystem for Linux on my Windows machine. It works great. The only thing that I have to complain about is that NPM tends to be a bit slow under Windows 10 and the Ubuntu shell. So I'm not going to actually wait for the full package to install. I'll just show you it getting started, and we'll assume that it finishes within a minute or two. In terms of how you create an application, and this is really more of a scaffolding, you could either type LB or LB app, and then basically you just follow the prompts and go. So I'm going to show an example of this, and again, I'm not going to wait for it to finish because it will be a tiny bit slow. But I'm just going to go in here and do LB app. Oh, I certainly could if I knew how. Nobody's asked me to tell my shell before. You know what? I do know how to do it on this. Properties, font, and we'll go to 36. Oh, that's beautiful. I'd say the scary thing of presenting and making your fonts bigger is that later on you're like, you know what, that's really better for my eyes. All right, so I will go back to where I was, which was here, and we'll do it again. So LB app, and we will call my application Cats Are Awesome the Best. And the rest is pretty self-explanatory. It asks me what folder to select. I'll pick what it did. Current version of Loopback is 3.x. Version 4 is being worked on. And if you go to the blog, you could see a couple different posts about what the thinking is about 4.0 and how you can be involved. And there's a couple of different scaffolding selections you could pick. The first one is the best. And then it begins the process. And like I said, I'm not going to sit here and wait for NPM to download the entire internet. Just trust me that it actually does work. But what I will show you, and y'all can tell me how big this is. Can you read the folders over here? Not really? All right, I will actually open up Explorer. And I hope I have nothing scary in here. Of course I don't. Okay, let's actually do large icons. So when you're done, this is like the root folder. Server is where the actual Node application is, and you can go in there, you can go crazy and look at the source code if you want. Client is actually an empty folder that the scaffolding will put in there. if you want to build the front end for your APIs in the same project. You totally do not have to. If you're doing something, for example, in Apache Cordova, you may have a totally separate project folder, but that is there if you want to use it. And you'll be seeing bits and pieces of these files as I go through. And I'm actually kind of curious to see if, oh yeah, it's still working. Yeah, download the entire, oh, there we go. It heard me complaining, so it's sped up right there. But essentially, this would be the same thing we just saw. So yeah, client, server, etc. So that just makes the application. How do we actually start building APIs? So one of the first things that you see about Loopback, one of the things that I really, really like, you don't actually design an API, which I am totally fine with. Like I could give a rat's butt in terms of how the API looks per se. Instead, I'm more concerned about the data. So I know, for example, that I'm building APIs that involve cats, and I already know what a cat is. It has certain properties, name, breed, gender, etc. What Loopback is going to do is allow me to define what a cat is by using a model. And it's going to make an assumption about what the APIs should look for in terms of creating, updating, etc. And again, if you don't like these assumptions, you could definitely go in there and tweak things later. But I think you'll see most of the time what it picks is going to make perfect sense. So the core the core thing that drives those APIs are models. You begin by describing the property. So what makes up a cat, a dog, etc. Excuse me. Models also support inheritance and relationships. So if I want to do something, for example, a cat model inherits from an animal model, I can do that. If I want to do relationships such that a cat has an owner and an owner has multiple cats, Loopback has full support for this, and the APIs will also support working with those relationships. I won't do anything that complex tonight, but just know that it's supported. And out of the box, from one model, you get full CRUD and search APIs. So what do I mean by that? Let's actually build this, and you'll see. And I will pick my nice big prompt here and do LB model. It's going to prompt me for a name, and I will pick cat. Don't worry about this particular question. In terms of base class, it's basically saying how this behaves, and persisted model means something that will be stored. Again, that default is fine. I definitely want to build an API for this. I'll say yes. It's going to ask me for the plural form. It uses an NPM module to figure out the proper English plural for cat. So I know that's going to find cats just fine. Again, some of these prompts I'm skipping over because it's not too important. This is the fun part. This is where I actually begin to define what makes a cat. I can say that a cat has a name, and I have different types of properties, and all these should be pretty much self-explanatory. I'll say a name is a string, and I'll say it's not required and has no default value. I'll give my cat an age, make it a number, not required, and I'll give my cat a breed, make it a string, not required, and no default. And then I'm done. So what did this do? I'm going to go back into Visual Studio Code. This is the folder I just made, and I realize it's a bit small, but I'll actually open the file and make it bigger. One model creates two files, a JSON file and a JS file. The JSON file, the JSON file, and how's that font size? Better? How's that? Cool. So all that command line did was just spit out a file. So if I forgot a property, I can just go in here and copy and paste or edit a typo, etc. But you can see where my properties are. There's definitely a few more metadata type options in here. The JS file is actually going to be empty. And this is where we will do custom things like custom validation, custom behaviors, etc. So I have these two files. If I actually go into the right shell and just do node dot, we'll fire it up. You can see I have a web server and what's called my REST API Explorer. So we will look at this. And you can see I was fighting NPM tonight. Who here is surprised that I was fighting NPM? Am I the only one who's had trouble with that? The default homepage for a Loopback app is simply a route that outputs uptime. And you could tweak that to say hello world or whatever you want. The fun part is under Explore. So what I have here is a complete testing suite for the APIs that I just made. So I have all the different REST-based methods I can call for cats. If I want to make a new cat, I can just open this up. It knows my model, so it actually gives me some default text to go in here, and I could make my cat name Elvis, 2 years old, and it is a foo cat. Click try it out. I get a curl command. I see the actual response body. And what I love about this is I don't have to go into a separate tool. I don't, like, for example, go into Postman and put in my URLs and copy JSON bodies, whatever. I don't have to actually build my front end, if I haven't yet, to start actually working with the data. And I'll go in here and just make a 20-year-old cat that is an enterprise cat. Just to try it out one more time. So this is working, again, out of the box, and I can run get cats and see my data. And if I really didn't trust the Explorer, maybe it's lying to me, I could see my data there. And again, this was all driven by me spending a minute at the command line and spitting out one JSON file. So if I didn't have any custom logic yet, and I wanted to switch to my front end, Vue.js, native, mobile, whatever, I'm actually done. I could just start building it. Let's take this a bit further and talk about how is that actually persisting data. So where were those cats being stored? So Loopback has a concept of a data source, and this is obviously where it's going to store information. It calls these things connectors, and basically a connector will define from the API to the persistence how that's actually stored. It has connectors for a variety of different persistent systems. Unfortunately, no Microsoft Access support, but if you have Mongo, SQL Server, etc., it's there. Notice that third option is memory. That is the default one, and that is how my little demo application was working. So if I kill the application and start over, all those cats are gone. We don't actually ship those connectors with that scaffold because it wouldn't make sense to. So if you do need Mongo, then you simply npm install that particular connector and you have support for it. You could also roll your own, and this is a true story. A particular client had data that was in MySQL and was in CSV files, not one CSV file, but like multiple CSV files. And it was some insane logic like product ID 5XXX was in a MySQL table, but also in a file that was called 5.csv. So to get a complete product, you were loading in a random file and doing a MySQL query. Well, we were actually able to create a loopback connector that put all that stupid logic kind of behind the scenes and build a nice API on top of that. When the client moved to a more sane system, the APIs just kept working, and all we did was change the actual connector. So I'm not going to show a demo of me setting up Mongo, but what I will show is kind of how this is defined. And again, it's just going to be more JSON files. So in my server folder, I have a datasources.json. This has a name and a connector type. And if I had a Mongo one in here, you can imagine it has properties for the URL, username, password, etc. I will show one kind of nice little tweak for the in-memory data source. I can do file.use files for persistence in production.db. And now it will actually save that to a file. And that's handy if I'm using something like NodeMon to run my Loopback app instead of just Node dot. When it reloads, I won't lose my data. And it may be temporary data, but I'd hate to have to keep like recreating sample cats so I could test my git commands. But if I were to actually kill this and restart it, it should have that file in there, or it may actually wait until I make a cat. So I'll just come back here, make that cat again, and you see it's ID 1, so it started over again. And now, oh, I didn't actually save. If I actually save my file and now try it, now when it starts up, I'm thinking the file should be there or after I make a cat. This time I'm sure that file is going to show up. There we go. So again, that's just a small little trick for when you're still in development, working with the in-memory system. Definitely don't do this in production. And if you do, don't tell anybody. Not that I've done that. So talked about creating the APIs, talked about how it's actually persisted. I showed at least part of the CRUD aspect. I showed making some cats and fetching, and delete and updating works as well. Loopback also has full support for searching, for doing ordering, for making the data set a bit smaller, as well as paging. Searching is going to support pretty much what you would expect. So equality, cats where name equals something. You can do comparisons, less than, greater than, also supporting less than or greater than, less than or equal to, and greater than or equal to. Supports and or. You can use a URL structure that gets a little bit complex, the more crazy your filtering gets. For one thing, it's pretty easy. So filter where, let's say, name equals Ray. To show, this is an example of doing LT for less than and obviously GT for greater than. And it gets a little bit wonky when you do an and or an or. So you have to actually specify an index for each clause and repeat the where and to let Loopback know that in this case where you want both of these to be true. So I will show this running real quick, and I'm going to make a new cat called sad. So we should have 3 cats in there. And this was my get command. And I know that URL is a bit small, but I'm going to do filter where breed equals, and I said sad, and there you go. So what's nice is that I don't have to actually build search for my application. It's already done. And back to that. You could do basic ordering, one or more properties, and ascending or descending. Again, query parameters, filter order equals property. The default will be ascending, and if you want to reverse it, you just do %20 for a space and DESC. I won't show this because it just kind of works as is, and you can put this along with the search to say, I not only want to find all the cats of a particular breed, but I also want to order that result set as well. And that's a more complex example of showing ordering by 2 properties. If you want to show or hide particular properties, you could say, I only want one particular property. So when you say, I want name, for example, Loopback is going to assume, if you're saying you want to show name, you probably only want to show name. If you want to hide a particular property, it's exactly what you think it is. You just drop the equals true. The docs actually show equal false. That does not work. I logged the bug report for that a while ago, but it hasn't been fixed. Just the existence of it like that, without the equals true, will actually hide that property from the result set. And again, you can mix and match different filters on that together. For paging, you have out of the box a count command. So I could do /API/cats/count. It'll tell me how many cats I have total. I could then do a limit, and I could do a skip. And in this case, it's up to your client-side logic to say, okay, how many cats do I have? Let me fetch, the current page and provide navigation hints so that the user can go through the rest of the cats. And again, all of this is baked in. I didn't have to actually add this myself. Validations, you saw when I was doing the CLI, it prompted me if something should be required or not. That's kind of like the simplest validation. You can also do things like a property must exist, which is required essentially, or you must not have a property. I honestly don't know why you would do that, but you can. You can also do things like a property must be a number, but it has to be an integer, so it has to be a whole number. You can also say it must be in a list or must not be in a list. A good example of this would be for gender. I could say for a cat, it must be male or female. You could also say that a value must be unique, but that's not supported across all of the different persistent systems. So check the docs on that. If you are a glutton for punishment, you can also do a regular expression and 100% custom validation as well. So for example, I keep forgetting, there's some cat breed that is either all female or 99% female. So you could have logic that says if breed is this and gender is not female, consider that to be an invalid cat. So here's just some examples. This would go into that JS file. That first one is basically a list check. The second one is an example of how I would say, age was numeric, but it has to be an integer as well. And if you see that and you think, well, what about a negative value? You have to do custom logic for that. And as you can see there in the third example, it's not hard at all. I basically write whatever my logic is, and I provide a nice message so that the client knows what went wrong with this particular validation. So security, you saw me create a cat model, fire up the app, and just make cats. The out-of-the-box security model is I love everybody and everybody can run every single API and go crazy. That's really handy when you're first starting and you're just kind of going crazy and rapidly building your front end. In production, you kind of want the exact opposite of that. So you want to lock everything down and kind of slowly open security back up. So Loopback definitely supports this. It has security models baked in already, and that includes user roles and ACLs, access control lists. You can define what users can do what with what particular models. You can also group users into roles. I'll back up. One kind of nice thing about that, you can have like really granular roles. So editors, approvers, whatever. I've also worked on a lot of web apps where basically if you logged in, you were an admin. And if you didn't log in, you were the public. Loopback has support for that. So you could say, for example, that if a person is logged in, then they have access to this particular security role. It also nicely handles the fact that, yeah, there's multiple ways to write data. You can create a new cat, you can update a new cat, but sometimes I just want to say write. In terms of reading, if I want to, I could lock down, maybe just reading all cats, but I will allow you to read one cat. Yeah, it's cool that I can do that, but most likely I just want to say read. So Loopback has very granular controls, but also some kind of nice shortcuts for, I think, more common things. I'll show a super quick demo. I won't actually run this because I know I'm kind of going late. But just to show you what that's like, I run the command line again. I'm going to go into my cats. I'm going to say all methods and property, all types of access, all users, deny, and I'm done. So at this point, I've locked down all access to cats. And if I wanted to now begin to open it up again, go back into cat, all methods, all access, and I'll say any authenticated user is granted access. So if I actually look at what that did, you could see it literally just dropped some ACLs in here. So if I'm pretty familiar with Loopback, if I know, what the JSON looks like, I could skip the command line and just write this in. Loopback does have a user model baked in with validation for email already baked in. So I could actually go back into my Explorer and create a new user, log in as that user, and test all the security. And again, it just works out of the box. So customizations, there's kind of 4 main different ways. I can build completely new remote methods. I could also do remote hooks. So I want custom logic to happen whenever a particular API or type of API is run. There's also a concept of operation hooks. So I mentioned that Loopback has kind of a simple ORM to persist and fetch data. I could add customizations at that level as well. And finally, it also has some nice customizations for Express. I won't show that, but the good example of that is in almost every single Express application I've used, I've done the static thing where I've said this folder is my static assets. So Loopback has kind of a shorthand to make that even easier. I'll show what customizations look like. And again, I won't run it for time, but just to give you some ideas, I'm going to start with, so this on top is an example of a remote hook. Basically, I'm saying whenever somebody calls an API, in this case, one that's loading data, I want to actually modify the result. My cat model on this example actually has a friendly property. It's a Boolean. And what this will do is actually say, when you call and ask for cats, if a cat is friendly, I'm going to modify the name to make it even more obvious. So Bob the friendly cat will be friendly Bob. If I wanted to make a shorthand for that, if I actually want to make an easy way for you to get friendly cats, I can define a whole new REST API endpoint. I begin by using a remote method API call. And you see here, I'm giving a name. I can get really precise on what verbs are used and what the path is. And then all I do is pair that up with custom logic. And by the way, this is an example that ORM I was talking about. It's very Mongo-like, but you can see here, my little filter there will fetch all the cats where I set that particular property. Now, this is one way of doing this particular type of logic. So it could be a case where I've had my cat API out for a few months, and I look at my logs and I see a lot of people were asking for friendly cats. They were using the question mark filter where, etc. So I built this to make it easier for them. There's actually a alternate syntax for that back in the JSON file in what's called scopes. And I could create a new scope, give it a name, in this case mean, and basically I've essentially flipped that other filter. In this case, what I will get is the exact same thing. I'll actually get a REST API endpoint, API/cat/mean, that would return all those cats that meet this particular clause. So I love this little shorthand. It's a really, it's a great way to respond to how I see people using my APIs. So that's just some examples of the customization. Some more things I'll point out. It does support Swagger and OpenAPI. If you don't know what that is, then don't worry about it. But if you want to import OpenAPI or export OpenAPI, Loopback can do that. It does have support for file attachments. So if I want to say that my cat model or my cats have a resume, and I want to support you saying when you build a new cat, I want to include a PDF for their resume. Loopback has support for that. It's not terribly easy, but if you go to our blog, I have an article showing you how to use that. You can actually build a model based on an API. So what you end up with there is essentially a proxy API. So if I wanted to support dogs, for example, and I didn't want to actually persist that in my system, and I knew that you ran a business across the street and you were all about dogs and you have APIs, I could actually add on my side a dog API endpoint that simply proxied to your side, and nobody would be the wiser. It also supports geopoints. That's actually a property type. So what's nice about this is that you can imagine in that cat model, I could have a location called, a property named location, type being geopoint. And out of the box, Loopback will give me all that crazy math of find me cats that are within X miles of this location. Now, I've had to build that before in like MySQL and essentially go into Stack Overflow and copying and pasting the crazy math logic. Loopback has that baked in. And again, a lot more than what I'm showing tonight. The docs will talk about it. Speaking of, I have a set of links here. That third link is the Loopback related blog post on the strongloop.com site. StrongLoop was the creator of Loopback. IBM swallowed them up about 2 years or so ago. So we still have that website and we still have a blog there. The fourth link is a Visual Studio Code extension for the JSON model. So it'll give you the nice code hinting when you work in the JSON files. And lastly, I'll point out I have a Lynda course, which is about 2.5 hours. So it's basically what I talked about tonight, but a little bit slower, and you get sample code and all that. And it's not free, but if that interests you, you can definitely check that out as well. Lastly, I'll point out, this is the upsell, obviously. If you want to build or use a gateway in front of your API, so you want to do things like rate limits, you want people to log in before they use the APIs, we have a product for that. It's called IBM API Connect, and it actually has a pretty good free tier to use, so you should check that out. And on that, I will open for questions. I will stop sharing so I can see your beautiful faces. Oh, thank you. It's all good.
Okay, I'm gonna be the runner for this. Got 1 minute. Do you support, goodness gracious, routing over a socket, or is it all just REST?
So what's the question? Is WebSocket supported? No. There you go. Yeah. That was an easy one. Thank you. Yeah, as far as I know, there's no support. I could be wrong, but last time I checked, there was not.
Right on. All right, next question.
Yeah, in one of the ACLs you showed earlier, it mentioned any authorized user. So where and how is it configured? What constitutes an authorized user?
So in that case, it would have been any user in the system, essentially. So it would have been open-ended. If you want to lock it down to a role, that's an option as well. So what you're seeing there is essentially, I can either say anyone who logs in can basically do this particular operation, or they must be a particular role. Loopback also supports the idea of object ownership. So you can lock it down to, if you want to edit this cat, they must have an owner property that points to the current user. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Oh, you're welcome.
Any more questions? We got one back there. Hold on.
So on those database connectors, are you able to define indexes, or are you just defining your model and that's it?
Yeah, so as far as I know, you can give hints to Loopback in terms of how it should create data. You could also tell Loopback to not create anything. Like if you don't trust Loopback to make tables and modify tables, you have a DBA who's very, very particular about how things are set up. You could definitely tell Loopback, listen, you're just reading, you're not changing anything at all. So it's yes. And I also want to point out again that if you don't want Loopback to make those choices for you, you can make them and have Loopback work with them. Hopefully that made sense.
It did, thank you. And one other question, that API Explorer web interface, it looks an awful lot like Swagger. Is that Swagger based or based on the Open API spec? So if you create an API through Loopback, you can port it to another Swagger, what's the word I'm looking for? Like builder, automated documentation tool?
Yes, you can output Swagger. It's command line based. And you can also import Swagger and it will attempt to make the models for you. I haven't tried that part myself, but I've definitely outputted Swagger from the command line.